I went to the top lady, sobbing. Diana said those words on tape, not to a journalist, not to the public, to her voice coach in a private session, sometime in the early 1990s, when she was still trying to make sense of what had happened to her marriage and the people who were supposed to help her hold it together. The top lady. That's what she called the Queen of England, her mother-in-law, the most powerful woman in the country, the one person in Diana's world who sat above the institution, above the protocol, above the men in grey suits who managed everything and everyone around her, the one person who, if she had wanted to, could have changed things. Diana went to her sobbing. She laid it out plainly. She said, "What do I do? I'm coming to you. What do I do?" And Queen Elizabeth II, who had been on the throne for 34 years, who had navigated the Suez Crisis and the end of empire and the resignation of prime ministers, who had sat across the table from Eisenhower and Churchill and de Gaulle, looked at her daughter-in-law, a 20-something woman falling apart in front of her, and said, "I don't know what you should do. Charles is hopeless." And then she said nothing more. That was it. That was the help. Diana's exact words on the tape, and that was it. And that was help. There's something in the way she says it, not screaming, not weeping. Just a woman, on tape, years later, still sitting with the memory of what it felt like to cross the most enormous threshold of her life, going to the head of the family for rescue, and being handed back an empty room. But here is what nobody talks about alongside that moment. Because there's a second half to this story that gets swallowed by the first. Diana didn't crumble after that conversation. She didn't retreat. She didn't keep waiting for the institution to fix what the institution had broken. She made a decision. And the answer she gave, not to the Queen, not out loud in that room, but in the years that followed, in everything she did and said and became, was the most surprising thing anyone in that palace expected. This is that story. Everything you're about to hear comes from Diana's own recorded voice. From the private tape she made for Andrew Morton in 1991 and 1992. From the sessions with her voice coach Peter Setterlin, recorded in 1992 and 1993, from the biographers Ingrid Seward, Tina Brown, Sally Bedell-Smith, who spent years interviewing the people who were in those rooms. Where the record is disputed, I'll tell you. Nothing here is guesswork. Before we go further, if this channel has ever given you a version of Diana that felt true, take 1 second and subscribe. This is one of those stories. Let's go back. Because to understand what Diana was asking the Queen for, and what the Queen's answer really meant, you have to understand what Diana had already been through alone. By the time Diana sat down across from her mother-in-law and asked that question, she had been carrying the knowledge of Camilla Parker Bowles for years. She'd known before the wedding. That's documented. She'd seen the bracelet with the entwined initials. She'd heard the phone call. She'd sat in the car on the way to St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29, 1981, and felt what she described as a sort of detachment, like watching herself from above, because the woman getting into that car already understood that the wedding was not what the world thought it was. On the honeymoon, the cufflinks with the 2 C's, Charles wearing them at a state dinner, Camilla's initials against his wrists. And then the years, the slow, grinding years of a marriage that Diana described as feeling like a performance with no audience worth playing to, because the one person she was performing for had already given his attention somewhere else. By 1986, Charles had fully resumed the relationship with Camilla. This is not speculation. Charles himself admitted it on national television in 1994 in his authorized interview with Jonathan Dimbleby. He said the marriage had irretrievably broken down before he returned to Camilla. Dimbleby's authorized biography puts the date at 1986. William was 4 years old, Harry was 2. Diana knew before the biographers confirmed it. She always knew. The phone calls, the weekends at Highgrove, the way Charles's circle closed around certain conversations when she entered a room. She said it herself. I knew something was happening before that. But the 5th year, I had confirmation. What she did with that confirmation is what most people don't fully understand. She didn't run to the press. That would come later. She didn't issue ultimatums that went into the tabloids. She tried, systematically and privately, to go through every legitimate channel the institution provided. She went to Charles, directly. She confronted him about Camilla, face to face, and his response in her own words on the Setterlin tapes was this: "Well, I refuse to be the only Prince of Wales who never had a mistress." That was his answer. As though the affair were a tradition, as though she were being unreasonable for objecting to it. As though the only problem here was her failure to understand the way things were done. She went to Philip. Prince Philip, her father-in-law. And what she reported from that encounter is one of the most extraordinary details in this whole story. On the private tapes, Diana said that Philip had told Charles years earlier that if the marriage didn't work out after 5 years, he could return to Camilla. My father-in-law said to my husband, if your marriage doesn't work out, you can always go back to her after 5 years. Which meant the affair had not surprised the family. The family had in some form already anticipated it, had already in some form planned for it. And then, with Charles unmoved, with Philip having already given his son a time frame, Diana went to the Queen. Picture that room. Buckingham Palace, one of the private sitting rooms where family business happens away from the formal state apparatus. The furniture is good but comfortable. There are dogs. There are photographs in silver frames. The windows are tall and the light comes in at a specific angle that doesn't feel like anywhere else on earth. And in that room is a woman who has never in her life not known what to do. Elizabeth II had been trained from childhood for exactly this, for the management of difficult situations, for the navigation of impossible competing loyalties, for the maintenance of an institution that had survived things that would have destroyed any ordinary family. She had been queen since she was 25 years old. She had sat across from Winston Churchill. She had written the letters that no one else could write. She had found a way through things that had no way through. Into that room walks Diana, 20-something, crying, not performing distress, crying, because she is a young woman whose marriage is collapsing around her, who has been told by her husband that mistresses are traditional, who has been told by her father-in-law that the affair was always a possibility, who has nowhere else to go. She asks the question she came to ask. What do I do? I'm coming to you. What do I do? And the Queen says, I don't know what you should do. Charles is hopeless. 3 things are happening in that answer. The first is a genuine admission of powerlessness, or at least the performance of one. A monarch who had handled every crisis her country had thrown at her for 3 decades, was telling a 20-something woman that she had no idea what to do about her son's marriage. The second thing is a quiet one. Charles is hopeless. Not, Charles is wrong. Not, Charles needs to fix this, hopeless. As though the situation was simply unfortunate, the way weather is unfortunate, something you endure rather than solve. The third thing, and this is the one that never gets talked about enough, is that it was a closing of the door. Not with anger, not with coldness, with 2 sentences. I don't know what you should do. Charles is hopeless. And then, nothing more. Ingrid Seward, in her book The Queen and Di, describes what the private sessions between Diana and the Queen looked like over time. A footman reported to Elizabeth that Diana had cried 3 times in half an hour just waiting to see her. Elizabeth's response, later, to a staff member, I had her for an hour, and she cried non-stop. That line tells you everything about the gap between them. The Queen experienced Diana's grief as something exhausting. Diana experienced the Queen's silence as something abandoning. Neither woman was entirely wrong, and neither woman could quite reach the other through the glass of what they each needed the meeting to be. Here is where honesty matters, because this story is sometimes told as though Elizabeth was simply cold, or simply indifferent, or simply on Charles's side from the beginning. The record is more complicated than that. Ingrid Seward's research describes Elizabeth as initially genuinely sympathetic to Diana. She had liked her. She had approved of her. In 1981, just before the wedding, the Queen wrote to a friend that she trusted Diana would find royal life less of a burden than expected. That's not the language of someone who saw Diana as disposable. That's the language of someone trying to be kind, in the only way she knew how. But Elizabeth's kindness operated within a framework that Diana's pain could not fit inside. The Queen was a woman who had made her entire life about containment, about not allowing private feeling to bleed into public function, about the monarchy continuing regardless of whatever was happening inside it. She had grown up watching her parents navigate a world war from Buckingham Palace. She had watched her uncle abdicate for love and nearly bring the institution down around everyone's ears. The lesson she drew from all of it, the lesson the institution had taught her from childhood, was that the personal must always be subordinated to the institutional. Diana's pain refused that subordination. Diana's pain was enormous, and it was visible, and it was not going to sit quietly in a sitting room and wait to be managed. And that more than cruelty, more than indifference, is what Elizabeth could not handle. Not the pain itself, the size of it. A biographer, Sally Bedell Smith, describes Diana during this period as surrounded by surrogate mothers, Lady Annabel Goldsmith, Lucia Fletcher de Lima, Elsa Boca, older women outside the conventional world who gave her what the institution couldn't. She collected them, Bedell Smith writes, precisely because the institution was constitutionally unable to provide what she needed. She went to the Queen and got 2 sentences. She went to these women and got hours. But there was one more thing the Queen did, and this is the part that the conversation about their relationship almost always misses. One more piece of evidence that sits differently once you know it. After Diana died, a letter from Elizabeth to one of her aides surfaced. Private. Not intended for public consumption. In it, the Queen described her feelings about losing her daughter-in-law. The words in that letter, their exact content, remain guarded. But the fact of the letter, and its emotional register, told those who read it that Elizabeth had felt the loss as a real loss. Not a political problem. A loss. Paul Burrell testified to something similar. He said the Queen, during the deeply strange days of Diana's theft trial, had summoned him privately to Buckingham Palace. And in that private room, not the formal room of institution, but the personal room, Elizabeth said to him, "Paul, I have written many letters to Diana, many letters. But the trouble was, and she said this of herself, I speak in black and white, and the princess spoke in colour. Black and white, colour, that's not the language of someone who didn't care. That's the language of someone who knew they'd failed to reach her and had found the word for why." So, what was Diana's surprising answer? Not to the Queen in that room. That conversation was already over by the time she left. The surprising answer was what she did next. She stopped waiting for the institution to fix her. That's the thing nobody expected. The version of Diana that the palace had calculated, and they did calculate, that's well documented, was that she would either collapse or comply. She would either break down entirely, which would be managed, or she would accept the arrangement and perform it gracefully, which was the preferred outcome. A third option, that she would quietly, systematically find her own power outside the walls they'd built around her, had not been fully accounted for. She went to Andrew Morton in 1991. She sat in a room alone with a tape recorder and answered questions sent through an intermediary, and she told the truth about her marriage. Every word of it. The cufflinks, the phone call, the years, the bulimia that the palace had treated as a private embarrassment, the self-harm, the loneliness. She named all of it and she put it on record, and she made sure it would reach the public. In June 1992, Diana, her true story was published. The book didn't name Diana as a source. The palace denied her involvement, but the detail was too specific, the voice too clearly hers, and the institution knew from the day it landed that the ground had shifted. Within 6 months, the Prime Minister was on his feet in the House of Commons announcing the formal separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales. 3 years later, in November 1995, Diana sat across from Martin Bashir on the BBC Panorama programme. 15 minutes before it aired, she called the Queen's private secretary to tell him it was happening. He told Elizabeth. The Queen watched it with the same 23 million people who watched it in their living rooms. She could not have stopped it. Diana had not asked for permission, and in that interview on live television, Diana said the sentence that the Queen had most needed never to be said out loud. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. Camilla's name, in Diana's mouth, on the BBC, in front of the world. The Queen moved quickly after that. She wrote to both Charles and Diana. The language of the letter was not a suggestion. It was a directive. The marriage should end, not asked, told. The Queen, who had told a sobbing young woman she didn't know what she should do, had now decided. The institution required a clean break. The divorce was announced the following year, but here's what that sequence of events actually reveals when you trace it from the beginning. The Queen's warning, if you can call the 2 sentences she gave Diana a warning, had been that the situation was hopeless, that Charles was hopeless, that there was no solution available to her. And Diana's answer, played out over 5 years of tapes and books and interviews and televised confrontations, was to say, "Then I'll find one myself." She went over the institution's head. She went to the public, and the public, the 23 million people who watched Panorama, the millions who bought the Morton book, the crowds that lined the streets in Australia and India and America just to see her walk past. The public gave her the thing the palace never had. Not power over the institution, something better, power independent of it. September 1997. The week after the crash in Paris. The royal family is at Balmoral. Diana's body is in France, then in England, then in a coffin in a room that the country is lining up to walk past. Outside Kensington Palace, the flowers are arriving by the ton, and the Queen is in Scotland, and the flags are not at half-mast, and the public, which has never been angrier at the monarchy in living memory, is asking why. It is the worst week Elizabeth II has had since she became queen, worse than the abdication aftermath she'd watched as a child, worse than the Silver Jubilee debates, worse than anything the institution had been through in her lifetime, because this time it wasn't a political crisis, it was a feeling crisis, and the Queen had spent her life building her competence on everything except those. On the 5th day she came back to London. She went to look at the flowers outside the palace. She bowed her head at the crowds. And on the eve of the funeral, she did something she had never done in 45 years on the throne. She broadcast a personal tribute, not a formal statement, a personal one. In it, she said she spoke not as a queen, but as a grandmother. She said Diana was an exceptional and gifted human being. She said she admired and respected her. She said the lessons of Diana's life would be taken forward in the work of the institution. The speech was not written by the Queen. She revised it. She made it more personal. She inserted the word I where protocol would have preferred we. Tina Brown, who spent years writing about Diana and the monarchy, said afterward that Diana's death had forced the Queen to do something she had managed to avoid for the entirety of her reign, show herself. Not the office, the woman. Diana had spent her life trying to show the Queen that there was power in that. In the personal, in the human, in the colour rather than the black and white. The Queen had spent her life building the opposite case. In the end, standing on a stage in Westminster Abbey, speaking to 2 billion people watching the funeral, the Queen bowed her head as the coffin passed. It was a small gesture, a private one, made public. The kind Diana had been making every time she shook a hand or knelt beside a bed or stepped into a ward where the cameras couldn't follow. It was the closest Elizabeth ever came to saying, "I hear you now." Leave her in that private room, sometime in the late 1980s. The sitting room, the dogs, the tall windows. She's in her late 20s. She came here sobbing and she's asked her question, and she's heard her answer, and now she has to decide what to do with 2 sentences and a closed door. She doesn't stay long. She doesn't push back. Not here. That's not what this day is. She gets up, and she straightens herself, and she does the thing she had learned to do since she was 20 years old. She composes her face for whatever comes next. But something has shifted in that room. Something small and absolutely final. She had given the institution one last chance to reach her. She had sobbed in front of the most powerful woman in the country and asked to be helped. And the most powerful woman in the country had said, "I don't know what you should do," so she would figure it out herself. And she did. Letter by letter, tape by tape, interview by interview, she built a version of herself that didn't require the institution's permission. She took the story they had told about her, the fragile one, the difficult one, the nervy one who cried non-stop, and she went outside the walls and she told a different story, one that 23 million people sat in the dark to watch. She never got the marriage. She never got the formal acknowledgement that she had been right and the institution had been wrong. She never got, in any official way, what she had asked for in that room. But she got something the palace couldn't have anticipated. She got the public. She got a place in the hearts of people who recognized, in her refusal to keep quiet, their own refusals, their own closed doors, their own 2 sentences and an exit. The Queen wrote her many letters. The Queen, in the end, said she admired her. The Queen bowed as her coffin went past. But the answer Diana gave to that room, to the question the Queen couldn't answer, and the marriage that couldn't be saved and the institution that had no colour in it, was the answer she gave with the rest of her life. And it is still being heard. Thank you for staying with me through this one. It's the kind of story that asks something of you. Because it isn't really about a conversation that went nowhere. It's about what a person does when the door closes. Diana was told there was no solution. She went and found one anyway. Not the one she wanted. Not the one she went into that room asking for. Something harder, and quieter, and more hers. That's not a fairy tale. That's something better. That's true.